Hello, I'm Simon Cook, a human geographer at Birmingham City University. I'm really excited today to share some initial findings from a new project I'm doing into post-collision cycling practices. This is a really important question, but one which perhaps doesn't really get much attention within cycling research. There's a huge interest and loads of brilliant work being done in understanding how we can create cycling societies, particularly paying attention to commencing cycling practices or how we get people to start, but there is less attention paid to perhaps how these sustain afterwards. So once we've got people cycling, how do we make sure they continue? And to me, collisions are sort of a key boundary situation within this discussion, a key event that may change or disrupt the course of someone's cycling practice, where it could arguably lead to it changing or perhaps falling apart. Unfortunately, in the UK, cycling collisions are fairly common. In 2018, about 17,500 people were hurt in some way whilst cycling. Unfortunately, I was one of them in that year. The image on screen is of me. And it really was that sort of personal event that catalysed my research interest in this topic. I started looking at literature related to sort of what happens after cycling, trying to relate it to my own experience, and I found very little. The one paper I did find on this topic is from 2015 and comes from Transportation Research Part F, in which the authors were looking at sort of behaviour change following collisions. And they note in their introduction that there really is quite an absence of research into this area, that whilst we understand perhaps mechanisms and prevalence of collisions quite well, understanding the onward behavioural effects or psychological impacts really is a bit of a gap in the literature. Another impetus for the project for me in particular is engaging and reading some of the literature on cycling collisions. It came across as very disembodied. Injury, trauma, risk, fear, all of these are sort of connotations or things that come about as part of collisions, and they're deeply effective states. They've got huge capacity to transform people's thoughts, feelings and actions, yet research into cycling collisions tend to focus on quite objective analyses of collisions themselves, the sort of contributing factors, attributes of them. This all leads to quite sort of a disembodied understanding of cycling collisions, and in trying to really piece together what longer term impacts this has on people cycling, perhaps a more embodied approach would be a useful one. And really this is where this project is trying to position itself, trying to build on the good work that's already done, but to start asking and exploring some questions which currently aren't particularly well researched. So more widely filtering into questions of how do cycling practices sustain, change or perhaps fall apart over time. It's very much interested in what happens to cycling practices after collisions. How are cycling collisions and their impacts lived and experienced? And that could be sort of health, recovery or sort of legal impacts and aftermaths. Particularly interested in what the experiences of trying to return to cycling are like. How do cyclists actually experience and live that? And then learning everything we can from that to try and understand the sort of the barriers and enablers that exist in sustaining cycling practices after collisions. What can be done to try and support people in returning to cycling? The approach I've taken to try and research this currently is a sort of narrative inquiry approach. And here this really puts a huge emphasis on stories as really central and powerful insights into people's experiences, but more specifically how they understand those experiences, how they make sense of them in a way that respects the mutability of narratives. And I think this is a particularly well suited sort of approach for researching cycling collisions, because people's experiences and stories of them are often shifting, often changing. This can be down to the simple fact that cyclists just may not know what happened in their collision. It certainly was the case for me, whereas I didn't know what had happened. Therefore, the stories I told about the collision the way I understood it was informed by a range of other people's narratives and stories, whether they're the police, healthcare professionals, solicitors, but equally sort of material stories and what stories that my body was telling. All of these became really important and fed into my own story and my own understanding of the collision and sort of my onward experiences of that. So in this way, narrative inquiry understands people's stories as sort of pieced together through various different tellings of an event that all feed into that experience. And it really tries to grapple with the transformative nature of narratives and of people's stories, how they have pasts and presents and futures and sort of continually unfurl. What I've done so far is essentially the pilot project, quite a small scale but in-depth look into people's experiences to try and identify some key priorities or key themes to take forward into a bigger project. I thought this would be quite a difficult one to recruit people for because it'd be quite a perhaps sensitive or emotive topic to talk about. But sort of one tweet and 12 hours later, I had over 100 people who had logged their interest in taking part in the study, which I think speaks both to, unfortunately, the number of people that are involved in these sort of collisions, but equally how interested they are and keen they are to share their stories and to use their stories to help improve the experiences of other people. So I sort of quite hurriedly had to close down my recruitment, and from that I tried to select quite a diverse set of people to interview. So there were 7 other cyclists who I did some in-depth interviews with, as well as engaging with my own stories and some sort of auto-narrative inquiry. All of those have been completed, and currently I'm at the sort of the early stages of starting to analyse the data. So in total there are 8 cyclists in this study. Includes a variety of collisions, so it's with cars, lorries, ice, walls and tram tracks. They vary in terms of how long ago they were. Some were quite recent, sort of 6 months, and some were much longer, sort of 12 years is sort of the longest I had. I aimed for an even gender split, but ended up with 5 male cyclists and 3 female cyclists, but the age range was between 20 and 65. Perhaps most significantly for this research is there was a variety of statuses in terms of returning to cycling. So half the people in the study had already returned to cycling, and perhaps can learn from them the things that helped them get there. And then half either were still trying to get back to it, and then one person was not trying to and had no intention of going back to cycling. So through these different experiences, trying to take some wider learnings about what can support people in returning to cycling should they wish to. So the early findings I wish to share today all sort of centre around the changes that people have made to their cycling practices after collisions to try and get back. These aren't necessarily permanent changes. There might just be changes that have been made to increase confidence, and then from then some of the sort of supports that have been put in place may have slipped away. But these are all sort of things that from a variety of different people have come up as useful stages in trying to get back to cycling, or changes that have been sort of forced upon their practice as a result of the collisions. And to try and understand how these fit together, I want to, I think the dynamics of social practice, sort of this streamlined model of practice theories that Elizabeth Shove and colleagues have put forward, it's quite a useful one for looking at it. And that's understanding practices that are made up of these 3 interconnected and related elements: the materials, so the stuff of a practice; competencies in terms of the skills and know-how that people have in doing a practice; and then the meanings they relate to it. And all 3 of these aspects have been discussed within this research as we're showing various changes which have been needed to enable people to get back to cycling, or have had changes forced upon them. So material changes is probably the biggest one that people seek to make changes to, either say permanently or in a more temporary fashion, to try and improve their confidence with cycling, or to try and persuade them to sort of get back into it. So there are some space-time changes that people make, which by this I often mean they're looking at going and cycling on different infrastructure, different times of day. So seeking quieter roads and times, perhaps seeking to use more off-road or sort of separated cycle infrastructure than they did before. And we also mean avoiding particular sites, whether that's the specific collision site itself or the sort of infrastructure that was on, whether it may be like a roundabout, A roads, or whatever the particular circumstance was. There's also changes to the bike, which people often discuss. So here, sort of trying to improve stability and safety. So quite often there's this change from using clip-in shoes to not, to give that a bit more flexibility of movement, looking to move to things like disc brakes or wider tyres to give that stronger sense of security, and likewise a sit-up bike rather than perhaps a road bike where you're a bit more angled downwards was discussed by a few people as useful. There are clothing changes that people make. People have discussed not trying to look like a cyclist, so almost giving the impression they're a less confident or perhaps are not a sporty cyclist, out of a belief that other drivers or other road users may respond to them differently. And the last material change is perhaps bodies. There was a discussion of cycling with others was quite common as a step in getting back to cycling. Competency changes was not as extensive. I don't think that the most common one was building up the fitness and the bodily form to get back to cycling. So this could either be responding to the injuries that were caused and a need to regain fitness or learning to cycle with a new body. And here turbo trainers were discussed by quite a few people in the study as a useful step. So before having to go out on the roads or outdoors at all, getting used to being back on a bike from a turbo trainer was discussed as a useful step for many in getting back to cycling. Likewise, there might be some sort of navigation competency changes if you're no longer cycling on the roads you're used to. Retune that mental map of where there are suitable cycling places and how you navigate them was discussed by a few people in the study, and sort of the technology and mapping software skills that may accompany that. And lastly, meaning changes were reported by quite a few of the participants in the study, but often as something forced upon their practice rather than purposeful changes. For most cyclists I spoke to, cycling became a riskier, more fearful practice and changed the meaning they associate with it. Things like counselling and just building up confidence and getting more experience have helped to reduce this, but for some people it's just too big of a barrier. Another meaning associated has actually been a strengthening of the love people have for cycling. And that's either come about because they've missed cycling, if they've had any time off it, they've missed the practice and the benefits it brings them. It can also be in comparison in terms of alternative experiences they might be having. So if they're no longer cycling to work but catching the bus, for example, those sort of comparative experience can actually strengthen the love that some people have for cycling, and particularly when they're able to get back to it and refinding the joy in it. This comes through quite strongly. So these are just some sort of initial findings that were coming out in terms of the changes to cycling that people were making to help them get back to it. There's much more to come from this project. There's some deeper analysis I want to do around the experiences of being back on a bike, how health and legal processes might affect the outcomes and people's experiences, and equally to do more work in identifying the barriers of facilitators to enabling people to get back cycling after collisions, all of which we're hopefully going to inform a bigger project down the line. Use this work to identify some priorities and sort of plans for that bigger project. So thank you very much for sort of listening today, and I'd love any thoughts, feedback or input. My contact details are here on the screen. It's a project very much at the start, so all input is very, very welcome.